Welcome to the Liberty Portal podcast. It's good to be back with you. My name is Joe Sheehan. I am one of your hosts for the show, and we've got a really interesting set of topics today. First and foremost, Ron DeSantis has formally announced his candidacy for president of the United States. Some Nazis neo-Nazis have raided Russia, as it turns out. Lots of interesting things to get into on that. And the debt limit, the time limit is approaching. They haven't made a deal. What's going to happen? Is the sky going to fall? We'll find out. Before we do, wherever you are hearing my voice or seeing my face, please do like, subscribe, comment, follow, and share the show. We really appreciate all of you out there who have been supporting us and helping get the word out. We're having a lot of fun doing this. We hope we're adding value to your lives, giving you information and entertainment. And one of the most informative and entertaining people I know is David Rand.
Great transition, man. You are nailing these.
You know what?
Well done.
I'm practicing.
Hey, everybody, David Rand here, and appreciate you all too. Don't forget to comment on these. That algo loves that, and that's how we got to feed that algorithm. It's like a beast, right? You got to keep it feeding those comments.
Keep it fed.
Keep it up, and appreciate it. Yeah.
Speaking of beasts, we got a Pudgy Penguin in our midst as well.
Less entertaining and less valuable than David Rand. But yes, I am here. They put me on the camera again. I am back. Nice to be here.
And you're going to see more Kyle in the future. Our friend Henri has had some very cool opportunities come his way, and he's going to be taking a step back. He'll still be around on the show from time to time, but Kyle's going to be filling those very large intellectual shoes. So good luck to you, buddy.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. We have to have him do an IQ score.
I'll have to talk about Coase theorem.
Yeah, you're going to have to brush up for sure.
I'll definitely have to brush up on some things.
And our boy Evan on the ones and twos back there. How you doing, Evan?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Recovering. Oh, we had a trip last week. Yeah.
Oh yeah, where'd you go?
We went to Las Vegas. A few of us. Yeah. Okay. It was first time going. What a city! I thought I understood people. Then I went there.
Yeah, and you'll hear my voice is still recovering from being gone.
Yes. Yeah, you all were in Las Vegas.
Yeah. Sorry, Joe.
That's all right. No, trust me. You couldn't pay me to go back there.
It's
not for another 10 years.
It's no Ireland, but you know.
Well, I don't know. There's a small Eiffel Tower there. There's probably like some other things that are, close to.
Yeah, we were basically in Egypt. We were in Paris. We were in New York.
Right.
We were in Caesar's Palace. It was
fair.
We were all around the world this weekend.
Micro tour of Europe.
Yeah.
Well,
by way of Nevada.
Knockoff version of that, of course. Yeah. That's the thing about Vegas is it's a giant scam. That's what it is.
Yes.
And the best way to enjoy it is to just go along with the scam. You know you're there to get scammed, and that's what you're there to have a good time with. And you lean into it, you have a good time.
Yeah. Interesting fun fact from a friend of mine who likes to play cards occasionally. He and his wife will go down to Vegas. Pro tip here. They went to the slots first night there, and they spent like $500. And as you're spending a lot of money, like the pit boss or whomever is managing that floor will come over if you spend enough, and they're like, hey, like, where are you staying? Oh, we're over in this hotel. Oh, well, can we give you a free room to stay here tonight? Oh, of course. Yeah, totally. And if you get their like loyalty card or whatever, and you spend enough money, you just go there planning to spend a few $100 the slots night one. They'll comp all sorts of stuff for you for the rest of your trip, and then continue doing it, send you emails and to try to get you back to spend money in their casino. So if you build that into the cost of your trip, then you can maybe save some money and get some nice accommodations and free meals and drinks.
Well, and all the hotels there are also built like a labyrinth to keep you trapped inside.
Of course.
Like it's like one big escape room, and you're just trying to get out without losing too much money.
Right.
Though that's especially true because when we went, it's a bunch of yokels from Montana where we're like, we can't navigate this place. There's no mountains to look at. How do you decide which way's north? Like it's impossible.
Like, I just see another slot machine.
Well, and I think intentionally, right? They don't put windows in, so you don't know what time of day it is. And no clocks, and they pump in oxygen to keep you awake.
I heard about that, which I kind of liked that. Yeah, no wonder I felt like I had so much energy. And I've never had so much fun losing so much money in one place before.
Yeah, we better get off this topic, or Evan's going to turn it into a blackjack stream.
Guys, I gotta go.
Well, let's get kicking into this news today. Ron DeSantis announced his candidacy for president by a very unconventional method, Twitter Spaces, which was sort of an interesting one because Elon tried to host it, and then the number of people that wanted in to listen to this live stream was like over 1 million people and going up by like 50,000 a minute. And I guess it crashed Elon's Twitter or something like that, and they had to host
multiple times.
They had to host it from David Sack's account, but it did eventually happen, and Ron, did his thing, and you listened in live.
I listened live. Yeah, no, it was at like 700,000 people when like the final crash on Elon's account happened.
Oh wow.
When they switched over to David Sachs' account, I think it peaked probably around like 300,000.
Gotcha.
But it did show that there was a lot of people flooding in, and it was interesting. Like, you have everybody saying it was a disaster, right? Like, you have the Trump camp saying it. And, you know, from one way you might say that because of all the crashes and stuff, but it did also show that there was a lot of energy, like a lot of people coming in. And, but yeah, it was a particularly more interesting, I think, in the latter half where it turned much more into like a podcast conversation. Like, it was more free flowing and just like free flowing Q&A and stuff. The actual like announcement itself was a little lackluster because like, DeSantis was trying to do the old school politician-y, like, this is why I'm running for office. And he had like a prepared thing.
It was like a campaign speech on Twitter.
It didn't feel natural. Like, it didn't feel like a Twitter Spaces. Like, I'm on Twitter Spaces all the time. It didn't feel like that natural kind of like podcast, everybody in a room together type of a thing. But once they got out of the campaign-y thing, then it felt pretty good.
Interesting. Did you listen to it, David?
I did not, but I read about it and I saw a lot of the post interviews on it. And I do think that's, the question is did it do a good job framing him as like an energetic candidate, or was there just the novelty of a different space being used to announce a candidacy? I mean, it's the first time being done that way. And you got to wonder if this was like a strategically good decision or not. If, you know, of course, they gave one crash, two, his energy didn't seem great or really match the medium. And third, like they launched this ad, you know, they actually kind of undermine their own case because they launched a bunch of ads beforehand to announce that he was announcing for presidency. Still went well, you know, it still had a lot of views, but I don't know that it's really the kind of launch that I think they were hoping for.
Yeah.
One of the things though too, and I saw somebody had this line of thought. I remember seeing like a thread of tweets was, it was like some campaign manager, some whatever at some point where they were saying that, you know, when you go through traditional means now, all anybody wants to ask you about is Trump. So like if you were just going to regular, like
legacy media,
like regular corporate press type of stuff, all the questions are going to be about Trump. But if you go into these alternative spaces, like you can finally actually like pitch your message, do your thing. So there is something interesting to that where it is interesting also watching things like Vivek Ramaswamy, RFK Jr., they're really tackling the new media space as part of their main message. I mean, like Dave Smith interviewed RFK Jr. last week, right? We're watching a changing dynamic. And I think a lot of the negative press on the Twitter Spaces stuff is also just coming from corporate press people that are not happy that their market share is moving away from them.
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting to your point, David, about like, did it make him look the way he wanted to look? I noticed, and this is me being sort of a production nerd, but the production value wasn't there. Like when he would talk, he was way quieter than David Sachs, than Elon, than most of the people who were tuning in to ask questions. And it was actually challenging to hear what he was saying for me. So like, as far as actually communicating the message, it didn't really do that very well for me. You know, and also that's another difficulty is you can't see them. So like if you're having trouble hearing them, you can't actually read lips or try to discern from their mannerisms what's going on. So I wasn't like really blown away by it personally, but I guess, you know, what's the polling say for him versus Trump right now?
I'm not sure. I can double check that.
It's still probably relatively low. I mean, Trump's still sitting over 50% of the Republican electorate. He's like 20s or something like that.
Yeah.
But that said, I don't think it's too early for the polling to be very meaningful. Yeah, right. There's still a lot of time left to go. That said, you got to wonder, like, does he have a brand that can be set up as the kind of charismatic leader the Republicans are looking for, right? Because that they need is you have to cut through the corporate press playing defense for Biden, right? How do you do that? Because you can only do so much on the alternative channels, right? You can build a following there. I think you're right. Vivek and RFK Jr. are doing a good job going to those alternative outlets, but they have to, right? So eventually you have to get to the mainstream because the biggest electorate are people who are not online, boomers.
Yes.
Right? That's the biggest voting bloc in the country. So how do you get to them? You have to go through the corporate press.
I'll give a yes, but I think Tucker Carlson leaving Fox News is going to change that dynamic. And actually, I just saw today, and I don't know if this has really gotten through the media yet, but I saw something that suggested that Tucker Carlson's studio was raided by Fox News in some way, and it was like dismantled. Like they were trying to sabotage his new show that he was going to or is going to launch on Twitter. But my parents, as an example, avid Tucker Carlson viewers, right? they don't watch Fox News anymore. And you saw the ratings hit that they took when Tucker left. Hannity and all the other shows lost like millions of viewers over the course of the following weeks, even the very, very next week. So to me, I think what that suggests is boomers maybe aren't a monolith in the way that we often paint them. And that perhaps they're more attracted to personalities as opposed to channels, right? Fox News obviously doesn't have that much loyalty, right? And so to that, maybe the new media is the place where they're going to find themselves migrating to as the voices that are actually speaking to them, that they believe are speaking truthfully, kind of get flushed out of the system as it becomes more and more corrupt and tries to control its pundits more and more. So
I think that's right. And here we have it. We got on MSN News, Tucker Carlson rebuilds after Fox News allegedly raided his home studio. That's wild.
Yeah, I would want to dig into it a bit more, but interesting. I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, I just saw it today, and part of me wonders, like, how does Fox News raid a studio? Like, can they just do that?
You gotta wonder if he had like kind of like a, your last day of work, you grabbed the stapler sort of situation kind of going on, but it was like a camera.
It was like their gear, so like we're taking all this back.
My understanding is he'd been filming like all of his stuff from his home studio for like a long time now. Right. So yeah, I don't know. Interesting, but
well, and I think to this as well, this should give critics of Tucker Carlson a little bit of pause, because I think a lot of people who are generally not right-leaning and maybe independents, left-leaning Democrats, etc., just look at him as like a stooge for Fox News, right? He's just like this sort of conservative blowhard or whatever. Why is it that the one real prominent conservative news station is raiding his studio? If he's one of them, if he's just part of this big monolith of media, conservative media, why are they doing that?
That's a good question.
And you would think that they would want to keep him on their
you would
on their thing if he was really
if he was towing the line,
trends of
right? If he was following the narrative and doing what he was supposed to do, wouldn't they want to keep his millions and millions of viewers? I mean, he had the best rated cable show by a long shot
in history ever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So similarly, right after the DeSantis announcement, he then went on Fox News with Trey Gowdy, his former colleague, and they did an interview there. I thought it had some interesting components to it when it comes to hitting on some of the major pieces for what a Republican candidate will care about, and then secondly, like what a president really has to engage in. And that's always the question. So yeah, quick reminder for those who haven't been tracking. Ron DeSantis was first a congressman, then he ran for governor, barely won as governor. The Trump, the Trump narrative was that Trump helped him get elected to governor, and that this is a loyalty question, that he's somehow suspect because he's not being loyal to Trump at this point by running against him, and then he got reelected by tremendous margin in 2020, or is it 2022?
2022.
2022.
Yeah. And he won by 20 points.
Yeah. Which historically Florida is a much more purple state than that. Very interesting on how that kind of played out, whether that's in net migration or people who are just converting to a more Republican straight ticket vote. That's, I think, still an open question. But they got into foreign policy, which Trey Gowdy is a hawk, right? He is a well-known hawk, and asked him about Ukraine. So we can cue that up.
You wore the uniform. If you are elected president, you may be the first one in a while to have worn the uniform. How would you address the ongoing war in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine on day one of a Ron DeSantis presidency?
Well, first, I think what we need to do as a veteran is recognize that our military has become politicized. You talk about gender ideology. You talk about things like global warming that they're somehow concerned in. That's not the military that I served in. We need to return our military to focusing on commitment, focusing on the core values and the core mission. That would be something that I could take care of on day one. There'll be a new sheriff in town as commander-in-chief, and I think you'll see recruiting start to get back to where it needs to be, because people don't want to join a woke military, and I think it's been really, really problematic. Look, in terms of what's going on over in Eastern Europe, I'd like to see a settlement of this. I do not want to see a wider war. I think it's completely unknowable what it will look like in January of 2025. But I would not want to see the United States with our troops get enmeshed in a war in Russia or in Ukraine.
Okay.
Pretty slippery answer. Like it's in there, and you can really pull out of it what you want. If you want to hear somebody who's kind of talking in a more restrained way, in a more Trumpian way, trying to pull those Trump votes away from him. This is how to assess it from political point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, I think leading with trans issues, and I think that's good political, but it's very concerning, right? You talk about like a proxy war with the largest nuclear state in the world that we're currently engaged in, with offensive capabilities going into Russia, into a country that has said if they feel like their government is under danger, they will use nukes. Like if that's a hugely consequential issue. And then to lead in with a very pithy answer about transgender issues and climate change in the military, which is an issue, but that's not what you're being asked about. And then second, to have such a vague, we don't know what it'll look like in 25. That basically leaves him the room to say like, well, the conditions have changed and therefore we have to keep doing this.
Well, right. And it was also very conspicuous that he said specifically, we don't want our troops enmeshed in a war. He didn't say anything about money or arms or, anything else. Right. So it's not saying I don't support this war at all.
It is. DeSantis is in a weird spot because in a lot of ways he is kind of seen as Trumpian in a sense, but he also is kind of forced to have to court the people that all fled the party because of Trump and like that hated Trump. So like he's like in this weird point where he attracts a lot of like the general MAGA movement people, but he also he has to attract like the neocons, and they're the ones with the political operatives that are surrounding him right now and trying to kind of make money off of his campaign and all this stuff, right? So I don't know. He's in such a weird just spot in this campaign.
Right. Because they also have Tim Scott coming out, right? Which is a U.S. Senator, South Carolina, I want to say, who's, very consequential for the Republican primary is South Carolina. Additionally, that he has a grassroots following. Tim Scott does. So, but he's kind of having a more establishment feeling campaign too in a lot of ways. So he has to try to box in there. Tim Scott announced on the same day DeSantis did. Didn't get any other coverage, of course. And then because the media, has a harder time with Tim Scott because he's black. But additionally that there's, Ron DeSantis has been like the face of anti-COVID, even though he's not, right? He was, pro lockdown until he was. With that said, tension against Trump in this space is very interesting, right? Because nobody's pro sending U.S. troops into Ukraine. Like literally no one said that as an issue, yet that's the thing that he's saying he's not. So to me, that's good campaign speak for, I'm totally open to this. I support the existing strategy. That said, he is saying that there was a sue for peace kind of component in there. He wants to see it resolved. So that's encouraging, but we don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, it's also not as strong of a stance as Trump in the CNN town hall that was just like, people are dying. Yeah. Like that whole thing, right?
Yeah. Right. And he would end it in 3 days or whatever he said.
24 hours.
24 hours. Yeah. It's like, okay. He would end it.
Which should be taken with a giant grain of salt. But as we covered when that town hall happened.
But the rhetoric is a lot stronger. And this is one of the things that I think DeSantis has against him in a lot of ways is, in a lot of ways, DeSantis is this kind of low energy nerd. Like that's and he's going up against one of like the biggest bullies that's ever entered politics, which is Trump. Like
the contrast with Trump does make him look very bland. Like even if he is an interesting person, it's like, trying to eat a ham sandwich after eating a jalapeno. You're not really going to taste anything. You know what I mean? It's just like,
well, it's also
an analogy. I like that.
Well, it's also like, I mean, these shouldn't necessarily be the factors that govern people's voting decisions, but they are. People are shallow like this. He's also kind of got this like whiny, nasally voice, and like those things do matter because people are looking for essentially a spokesman for America, right? And I think just traditionally the nerdy guy isn't the one that is going to be the one that gets the nomination. Right?
There's this tension between having the right policies and having the right brand
and charisma,
or charisma to sell those policies. And the question is, can DeSantis cultivate that? Is it too late to cultivate that? During COVID, right, he had a lot of pushback from the press. He did a good job about defending himself at press briefings and things like that to actually really, stand on where he was actually, solidly standing, which was, everyone else is still locked down. I'm not locked down anymore. So I do think that there's a space for him that he can get to there. It's just the question is, will he in the pressure of a presidential campaign, or is he just being pushed to run? And this is going to be, him being drug into the situation where his more natural, normal attitude kind of comes out and maintains.
Well, and I think a lot of his popularity during COVID was a lot of people read about the things that he was doing and they never actually saw him speak, right? So I think a lot of people had this vision of who he was that was not accurate necessarily, but now that they're seeing him like full front, they're like, he doesn't have that Trumpian energy I wanted, like there's kind of that dynamic that's at play.
I think for a while he was trying to cultivate that, like, months ago, even during COVID, you saw some of the mannerisms come out and like, some of the different things.
When he won too, like he had this big election speech that was like, we're going to destroy wokeness and we're going to, he was doing that thing.
His version of drain the swamp, Yeah, you saw that, but then I think he has to distance himself visually and from a brand perspective from Trump. And obviously, he wants to create his own space within people's minds, and obviously there are people that love Trump and there are people that really don't, and I think he's probably trying to cultivate more on the other side of that.
Well, and this is an anecdotal thing too, just conservatives in my own life that there's a lot of people that were like Trump supporters in the first 4 years, but they're kind of like ready for that to be done with, and they started to move to DeSantis. Like there's that kind of energy is like, now we can kind of go back to normal. Like I think that's who DeSantis is kind of getting, is like some of that Trumpian energy, but also a little bit back to normalcy. I think that's where a lot of the mindset is.
You always have a couple questions, right? Can he get through the Republican primary, which is I think the hardest part for DeSantis. The second, can he get the general populist vote? And the swing vote that matters the most when it comes to every election in the United States today is the white suburban female. And how will they vote? And that was the Trumpian problem, right? There's a certain amount of those folks who are like, I like this guy, I'm down for it. Or I hate Hillary Clinton so much that I'm willing to vote for this guy.
The anti-vote. Yeah.
Right.
The mystery box candidate. Like we know who Hillary is, but we don't know who Trump is. So let's just gamble on it.
Right. I think that's accurate. And will that dynamic persist through this? And is DeSantis more favorable to that crowd? When you look at it, it's easy to look at it just from the point of view as a political person, right? Who's into politics. And you kind of see this, who has the best policies, who has the best like campaign strategy, that sort of thing. And that's how Republicans want to act, but they can't, right? Because you have this phenomena of like, but the anti-establishment so strong in this moment, the internet obviously enabling a large part of that. But then the question is even if that Republicans have to struggle with, if Trump wins, can he win the general populace, even in this condition? Because remember, 2020 was not a situation where he was the incumbent operating in the middle of a pandemic, and he couldn't pull that one out with a geriatric who barely left his basement for the entire campaign cycle,
who got more votes than any other president.
Right, and that's there's a lot of questions for that. Like, how much of that is just people saying, I don't like the current situation. I want anything different than being locked into my house.
The mystery box.
Right.
Well, now we know what's in the mystery box, and it ain't shit.
Well, and there's also an element too of Trump was ineffective at actually commanding the swamp in a way. Like he was ineffective at controlling his own administration, and a lot of that might be like, is that a problem of Trump or is that a problem of the swamp? But and there's probably questions there on that. But he was not necessarily capable of kind of taking that control like he said he was going to.
Right.
And and he was bogged down. Like, you had the Pentagon was lying to him about troop movements in Afghanistan, and like it seemed like the intelligence apparatus was completely against him and trying to like frame him with Comey and stuff. So, it's just like, but there's a question, if you vote him in, is he going to be able to manage it, or is it going to be a lot of just what it was last time, right?
And there's one additional one that's interesting here, that you have mostly digital campaigns going on by Trump at the moment, right? He has done CNN and stuff like that. But DeSantis, who is 44, he's 5 years older than me, right? Versus Trump, who's almost 70. Mm-hmm. Right.
Look him up. I thought he was pretty close in age to.
I thought he was almost approaching 80.
I think that's
right. You're right.
He's in the 70s. Yeah.
So that generational difference, the biggest voting bloc once again is boomers. And so are they going to be, is it palatable for them to, elect a Gen Xer?
True. It's a good question.
He's 76 years old.
What's Biden?
That's what I'm just looking up.
81,100.
Not how he acts.
He's a vampire.
He's 80. He would be 82 November 20, 2024.
Oof.
I don't know about that, man. I really hope that, well, I hope that if Trump gets the nomination, that people aren't so afraid of him that they vote for Biden again.
Well, we just talked about hate voting, and we saw that happen 2 years ago. I think the worry is that it'll just be a repeat of last time.
Yeah, that would be the worst case scenario. I would love to see RFK get the nomination.
We're also assuming Biden gets it. Like RFK's strategy is pretty interesting right now, and he's climbing in the polls right now.
Yeah,
there's a lot of time to go.
I mean, I just saw Dave Smith tweet that his rank of candidates right now is topped by RFK Jr. If he were to vote for anybody right now, he would vote for RFK.
For me, it would be Vivek, and I feel like a lot of the libertarian types haven't like fully looked at Vivek yet.
He's been making the rounds on those podcasts, but I do think we do have an interesting situation there where you have Vivek, who's a millennial, right? He's literally my age, and a more digital campaign that's happening there that I don't think is broken into the mainstream, but he has definitely the strongest like case arguments for what and he's charismatic.
Yeah.
Right. He's both policy pretty good and very much a leader type. RFK has an interesting thing because I kind of think of his campaign as he's reintroducing liberalism to the Democratic Party.
Exactly.
Which
It's an
is
ideological
fascinating.
campaign.
Yeah, right. It's kind of reminds me of like Ron Paul in a sense, right? Kind of reintroducing the libertarian spirit back into the Republican Party in the Bush years, right? Where there's a whole bunch of folks who are like, man, I don't like any of this, and I identify as a Republican, and I want to be that space, but none of this makes sense to me. I don't like the Iraq War. I don't like all these things that the Republicans were doing at the time, the bailouts, the big spending, all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, he tapped into that, and of course, it didn't go anywhere. The establishment opposed him, made it very hard, and the Democrats have it even harder, right? Republicans don't have superdelegates, right? Like RFK's pathway is way harder than Bernie Sanders even.
Can you explain the concept of superdelegate?
You know, I don't know that much about the details of it, but effectively what it is like another layer of voting in order to get a candidate into place, and that those are like the elite of the Democratic parties get special votes and that effectively count more.
And I believe a lot of this was introduced in that Debbie Wasserman Schultz when the stuff, that kind of scandal when the WikiLeaks came out and stuff. I think a lot of this was like super enhanced during that time period, if I remember right. And it was actively to like hit Bernie Sanders and make sure that he couldn't get through.
Well, no, superdelegates are old. They've been around the Democratic Party for a while.
But there was like a rule change around the superdelegates that happened in 2016, if I remember correctly. That's 7 years ago.
Yeah,
We don't need to go too in the weeds on it, but just the idea that there are certain votes that have more power, more leverage than individual delegates
in the Democratic Party specifically, which is interesting because they have the name Democrats, but they don't believe in equal rights to vote or equal representation when it comes to picking their presidential candidate. And that was used against Bernie in this really insidious way that we discovered, that Hillary was collaborating with the media to make Bernie look bad, get special treatment by the media. But then the Democratic establishment made it extra bad. And rather than, basically calling it out and opting out the way Ron Paul did, Bernie Sanders pretty much said, well, I'm Hillary's side now because
I'm a team player.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I don't think that happens with RFK, right? He's out now. I mean, the guy is anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine. He is out. I think as far as policy, I do think a lot of folks are so energized by the anti-COVIDism that they're not looking at all of his other points of view on things.
Well, it's one of those things, right, where like a lot of the very important issues, I think just like general anti-establishment energy really likes, but he's going to be bad on the issues that we would like the three of us would generally disagree with Democrats on, right? Like a lot of the climate stuff, a lot of that type of
and it's not
general
just
economic policies, social safety nets, single payer healthcare. Like he's going to be bad on he's like a Jimmy Dore, right?
Right. He's gonna be bad on that. Except that his rhetoric in that space was very extreme, right? When he was just an environmental lawyer, he claimed that people who pollute should be put in jail for climate change purposes. Like he wanted to incarcerate people. That's very radical rhetoric. I don't think that matters as much as the other things, right? Because he just doesn't have the capability or power or political ability to implement that. But he would that. But his campaign's relitigating COVID, right? That's already done.
Well,
what's his actually vision for?
I mean,
how does he actually build like a forward-looking campaign that actually really imagines a different future for the Democrats?
I think that's a fair question, but I think he's been pretty explicit about the fact that he's not running on his stance on vaccines. He's not trying to rehash that.
Right.
But every platform
Everyone
that he
wants
goes
to ask
on.
him about
Yeah,
it, though.
right.
Wants
Like
to-
there's the whole crystal ball interview that went pretty viral, right?
Right. And I mean, and I think he's been pretty open, especially in that interview, about, you know, if there's good evidence to suggest that I'm incorrect about this, I will change my view. And also, you know, on one of his other interviews that I watched, I believe it was the All In Pod, they noted, and I noted as well, that he was quick to say, I need to look into that further. I don't have enough information on that. And he did that a few times, enough times to where I was like, for a presidential candidate at this stage, who's announced, who's doing the circuit, you should probably have like a stance on some of these things, like major issues like education freedom. You know, they were talking about he believes in freedom in one space, but then necessarily, you know, he believes in strengthening public schools and doesn't necessarily believe in education freedom as much as he should if he's being consistent ideologically. And so there are some question marks. There's like blank areas in my understanding of what he really believes and how he truly feels and how he will govern on certain issues. Right. You know, and another example being talking about, you know, he doesn't want to touch Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, obviously, because it's a third rail for any candidate, and they would never win.
I mean, you can't talk about that in the Republican Party either.
You can't talk about it anywhere.
Vivek is talking about it. But,
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, well, because he's a millennial and he knows he'll never get it, but
well, he's also like a billionaire.
that's also true. He doesn't need it.
Almost a billionaire.
But he does talk about, you know, looking at budget deficit from a perspective of reeling in the military, right? Reeling in this, you know, expansive defense system that we have, bases all around the world, that sort of thing. So there are certain things where it's like he is edging into libertarian territory, he is really appealing in certain ways, but there's still a lot of uncertainty for me.
Right. And I do appreciate that his actual foreign policy points of view are actually compatible with that. One of my great irritants is how many Democrats say, we can't make this budget deal. It doesn't have enough defense spending cuts in it, or doesn't have, in the case of the ones going on, no defense spending cuts, while they simultaneously advocate for more military spending at the exact same time, right? They use that as two separate talking points as if they're not the same thing. Right. And I appreciate that RFK is good there. He's good on, he actually talked about the Fed fairly intelligently in a way that I was interested in. And as far as like restraining spending, hey, I'm open to someone actually talking about that.
Yeah.
And it does, I would stipulate that he would probably govern moderately. And I would appreciate that in a lot of ways, right? He would have to, especially if the Republicans take back the Senate, which looks very possible, and maintain the House, which looks within the realm of, you know, possibility.
Well, yeah, and also last point on it, I think that his stance on Ukraine was pretty direct and definitive, that he doesn't support it, and he would work immediately to bring an end to it.
Right.
Which brings us into that. If you guys feel like we've had our
one last point on the RFK thing is like I'm just noticing this with like lefties in my own life that, you know, we'll vote Democrat no matter what, but like, you know, you grab a drink with them, grab coffee with them, and there's this energy that is just like, man, I just don't like the where things are going. You know, like there's like this complaining is just like, I just don't like where the party's going, and I just want a little bit of normalcy into the thing. And like, so like there's that is feeling. And I think RFK is really attracting this like pent up energy that exists within the Democratic voter base. That's just like, oh, we've just gone too far. Like, I just don't like how far we've gone, but they're afraid to talk about it, you know, right? Like there's that fear factor. And then they'll go to someone like me and they'll just be like, oh, Kyle will keep my secret. Like, you know, like,
And then he says it on a podcast.
Yeah.
Right on here.
No names. If you're listening, you know who you are.
Yeah, there was an interesting part of the DeSantis thing. Return to that. One of the best congressmen in the legislature for the federal government is Thomas Massey. And he got onto the spaces and asked DeSantis about regulatory reform, specifically the REINS Act, who immediately said, that's no problem, absolutely can do, let's do it. And that is a tremendous win, right? I mean, think about the Trump administration. They had the House, the Senate, and the presidency for 2 years, and they passed one tax cut. That's it. Right.
Can you go into a little bit of detail on what the REINS Act is?
So the opportunity cost was enormous. The regulatory reform for Trump happened all on the executive branch, right? So within the executive branch, they can determine as the presidency how it runs to a certain degree because there's a lot of rules around things that have kind of ossified the bureaucracy. But there was no like effort from Congress in this space. And the REINS Act has been around for some time. It passed in Wisconsin. Basically what it does is it says if every new regulation has to have an economic impact study. When that economic impact study passes a certain threshold, in order for it to become a new regulation, it has to become a law first.
Oh,
It has to be passed by Congress and
Great.
pass the presidency. It would drastically slow down the growth of the administrative state. It's proven in concept in Wisconsin, right as Walker was leaving Wisconsin as governor, he passed the REINS Act. And since then, it's been a series of Democrats. It has substantially restrained the growth of the party. Nice. We had an explosion.
Okay, so I gotta give a shout out to Griff at Zesty Bev here on this one, because there are some overcarbonated Arnold Palmers out there in the world, and that is one of them. So
This is the same type that on a previous podcast I was in the back like,
Yes, it is.
no.
I have to say, despite their exciting entrance, they are very worth the little bit of cleanup. We're gonna pop to a quick Zesty ad while we clean this up and open a couple more Arnold Palmers. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Zesty Beverages. They're on a mission to unf the standard American diet by crafting drinks with fewer calories and more nutrients from real food. Their lineup of delicious offerings now includes Electric Peak Yerba Mate, post-biotic sodas, keto-friendly, ready-to-drink margaritas, and hard teas. Wondering what a post-biotic soda is? Well, head on over to zestybev.com to learn more and find a retailer near you. Once again, check them out online at zestybev.com. That's zestybev.com. No, to be clear, there were a couple of cases that got left somewhere they shouldn't have, and so we got those cases. You have no fear. If you go buy an Arnold Palmer at your local grocery store, convenience store, it's going to be delicious, and you're going to love it. And you should check it out because it's really good.
It's my favorite flavor.
It's super good. We got half and half, right? It's hard tea and lemonade, about 5% alcohol by volume. And you got this handsome shredder on the front, or whoever that is. If you follow the Zesty Bev page on Instagram, you'll see a picture of my brother Sam when he cut a really nice handlebar mustache. Got juxtaposed with the can, and the resemblance is striking. Pit vipers and everything. It's beautiful.
You're gonna have to put like a picture up right next
I will
to
do
it,
that.
right?
I will do that.
Superimpose.
Yeah.
So the REINS Act, did we get that far enough? Putting that on the federal level will be enormous. There are so many lines of the federal code that we don't know how many regulations exist. Like audits of such things actually come back with we know how many pages there are, and there are pages and pages.
For those of you just listening, David's motioning off the floor like 5 feet. Stacks.
Yeah, and the amount of estimated time to read them would take years.
Well, this reminds me of that time Nancy Pelosi said, well, we have to pass the bill in order to know what's in it or whatever.
Right. And the bureaucracy is doing that every day, passing new rules and regulations. And important to note that mens rea does not apply to those.
What is that?
Mens rea is the legal concept that in order to that you're only guilty of violating a law if you knew it was illegal.
So that doesn't apply to regulation.
not to these. Right. So you are liable for complying with a code, even if you know it doesn't exist.
I thought that ignorance of the law was no excuse.
That's what it is. But the English, the common law tradition didn't have that. Right. That's a progressive era trope that came about later when we decided to create the bureaucratic state.
Got it.
Right. So it is made everything much more litigious, made everything much more needful to have a lawyer on staff in order to comply with the law, depending on your industry. We have this on the state level too. I mean, states are also doing this. So there's some real great analysis of state regulations and how burdensome they are per capita or by state and things like that. But then on the federal level, it is such a huge problem that, people serve time for things like, I put a retention pond on my ranch. The guy went to jail for that. People serving time for trapping lobsters in the wrong kind of cage. Things like that micro-regulated industry, perhaps in maybe good ways. Who knows? I'll be open to that. My lefty friends will say maybe it should be good. But at minimum, the government has a responsibility to at least, one, know what the economic impact is. In Montana, for example, we had another situation where the previous governor was going to ban all vape cigarettes. Right? It had an economic impact, $300 million or more. And he could just, Department of Health and Human Services just introduces it. It wasn't for a legislature that got on top of it and the tobacco industry that went and said, hey, this is a huge problem and rose up the issue. It could have passed. Right? There was no fundamental check on the creation of new ways that you could go to jail or be fined for.
Wow. Yeah, so the REINS Act, which you said passed in Wisconsin.
Yep.
It's a law in Wisconsin.
As far as I know, it's the only state that has that. There are some states that have similar things. I think Michigan has something similar in like that field. But Wisconsin has by far the strongest. It's the model legislation for the country.
And so that legislation has been introduced? in Congress?
Yeah, for some time now, but it's never
It's just
gone
been
anywhere. Right?
eddying out and waiting
Yeah,
for
right.
someone to care about it.
Yeah.
So DeSantis said he would sign it, no problem.
Yes, which is a great commitment. I mean,
Assuming he keeps it. A lot of things are said on the campaign trail that never come to fruition, right?
Never forget, Bush ran as a pro-peace, anti-nation building president.
There you go.
Most presidents run on being anti-war. It's just once they get in, it's the...
Didn't Obama as well?
Yeah, Obama was entirely...
then
started like 7 new wars.
Yemen, Libya.
Yeah.
I don't even know them all.
But yeah, it's just like that is the thing is
Syria.
you can never really trust politicians on what they say they're going to do when they come in. Also, it's just like things are way more complicated than just coming in and just with the stroke
signing
of
on
the
the
pen
dotted
being
line.
able to do things as well. Like the president doesn't have all the power in the world as well, as much as people think that he's like a king. But
He has way too much power. If you're getting into the aughts, he ought to have way less. And yeah, with control of the administrative state, he can do quite a bit. But even that is statutorily limited by things Congress has passed that makes it impossible for him to fire people and change things in the bureaucracy. So I think the commitment is substantial, right? Because a lot of people would have worked around that. If you would have asked Jeb Bush that, I think he would have tried to like, I can consider it and get into it when I get there. But as far as it is interesting too that it was Thomas Massie that said that, because Thomas Massie, just a reminder, was the one lone representative who forced Congress to take an in-person vote on the first CARES package. So they shut down the economy
During COVID.
There was a CARES package that was meant to like help subsidize people who couldn't go to work anymore.
That was our stimulus checks and everything.
Yeah.
Right.
And Congress was going to vote on it without a formal vote. And he insisted it. So Trump came in and said, well, this guy's a loser. He's nobody.
He's a third-rate politician that needs to be primaried in the 2022 election.
Wow.
I would like to remind Trump people that is exactly, you guys were the ones calling him a masshole on Twitter, right?
Wow.
I would like to remind you guys that.
Right.
Assuming any Trump people listen to this podcast.
But it was the thing. It's just like, that everybody fell for it. It's like the Patriot Act. It's like all these things. Like when the emergency comes, then they're like, people always like to think when the emergency comes, I'll be the one that stands on principle. It's like, no, most people will be the ones like screaming at Socrates to take the hemlock when he's tried to kill himself for corrupting the youth or whatever.
Right.
Like that's really where most people generally are, is they'll just follow the crowd.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson has some good takes on that whole phenomenon, I think.
Definitely. And it was that moment, and that's where we're at in the war, right? Right now, we're at the moment in the war where people who don't know anything about the history of American NATO relations with Russia are currently vociferously advocating for bringing us on the brink of nuclear war and using the lives of Ukrainians as the currency to do so with a lot of reckless rhetoric that has led to our other story, a far right. And when we say far right, we've got to clarify this.
Neo-Nazis, man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so when the American ear hears that, because of the progressivists, but spent so much time talking anyone who isn't a progressive, a Nazi, you might be forgiven for thinking, oh, well, this is just a group of guys who are conservative or kind of right wing. No. Ukraine and a lot of Eastern Europe has a history that's very deep of post-World War II culture maintaining a neo-Nazi ideology.
Like these are actually the grandsons of the Nazis.
And they brag about that. This isn't us like castigating them. I would always be very careful calling anyone a Nazi, right?
Of course.
Mostly because I've been called one so many times for having very normal views about most things. And so I would always hesitate to do that. But in this case, these guys themselves don't call themselves that per se. But if you look at what they say about what they believe in and the way they're trying to say, no, we're not that. We're rebranded now. Like we believe in more mainstream things. They are still racial supremacists, nationalists, socialists, and people who are definitely in that space that if you listed out the Nazi, agenda and what they believe in, it is very, very tightly correlated.
Well, worth also noting is that these are also the same types of people that we were funding and aiding in the 2014 revolution in Ukraine as well.
Yeah, so the NGOs,
and if you ask the neocons when they're doing, they're just like, well, I mean, they're kind of different, and they try to be wishy-washy about it, but they'd be like, like, you can say it, they're Nazis. We're funding Nazi militia groups. Like that's
Okay.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah. So the NGOs like the Soros Open Democracy Project and organizations like that, definitely in 2014, you go on the website, you can look at it. They're blaming, or they're taking credit for encouraging pro-democracy pushback to a democratically elected person who happened to be more Russian orientated than EU orientated in his foreign policy and in his trade policy. The interesting thing that's happened recently with those groups is using American military equipment that has been given to them on the backs of U.S. taxpayers have invaded the territorial integrity of Russia on a raid. They were stopped. As far as we know, the reports that I read indicates that they were almost completely wiped out. But this is a very dangerous moment when you think about it. Using American military equipment, we have far-right extreme neo-Nazi types going into the integrity of Russia and causing chaos, right, and attacking them. Now, you might say, hey, look, this is what happens in war. You need an offense in order to have a defense, things like that. There have been some justifications on CNN, for example. They had a former general come on and say, like, hey, this could be a great strategy. While simultaneously the Defense Department is saying, and Ukraine is saying, we didn't actually ask for this, right? These guys are acted alone, right? Plausible deniability. Very concerning, because what that indicates is either that Ukraine is in charge of their own troops, right? Which is scary. We're talking about the largest nuclear stockpile in the world, and what the media claims to be a crazy person at the helm, right?
In Russia
with Putin, right? The stories have kind of disappeared, but like 2 seconds ago, they were all talking about this guy's crazy and he's insane and is sick or something. Or second, that this attack was supported by the U.S., right? And they just want a plausible deniability, which is probably the most likely outcome, right? Because you think about it, like, how often does the government lie to us? All the time. Would it lie to us if it was saying, hey, militia, plausible deniability, go in here and cause some havoc, try to get their attention over here so we can attack over here?
Well, it does remind me a lot of the Middle East, of how there's all these different factions at play. Like how much of the Ukrainian military is actually like centralized under Zelensky? Like, there could be all these factions that are just like, no, we're just going to go joyride through Russian country right now. Or it's like, oh, we're just going to send a drone to the Kremlin. Or it's like, oh, we're just going to launch a missile into Poland. Like there's all these things of like how much of it is actually central. Like, there could be a lot of different factions at play that we don't even really understand. And,
That's right.
And in the same way in the Middle East, of how we're just like, we're going to fund this, like, Shia Ziyah group, or like all Al
Shia
Nusra
group, or
Al Nusra Front,
yeah,
and all this stuff. But like, like the Taliban is actually factionalized in there. So when we're just talking about like the Taliban, it's like, well, which part of the Taliban? Like, there's a lot of different Taliban. Mm-hmm. I could see that being the case in Ukraine.
Right. It could be a mixture of the two, but it is asking a question. It's your tax dollars being used on this. And is this how you want it? I mean, like, all throughout the buildup to this war, we kept on saying these are defensive weapons, right? Defensive weapons is a highly subjective claim. It's defensive to me if I'm defending myself with a weapon, but if I'm looking at you down the crosshairs, it definitely seems offensive to you, I would assume.
For sure.
Right? We're not just selling them body armor, we're selling them rocket systems that can both shoot down rockets and have nuclear warhead tipped missiles put into them and then shot into Russia with a 4-minute, time to prepare.
That is as much an offensive weapon as there could be.
Right. And this you go on, Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, these guys have descriptions of the weapon systems that they sell, and they say they can be offensive or defensive. But then when we sell them, the press release says defensive weapons.
Market them as defensive. Well, I mean, this is interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but was it not the NDAA, one of the NDAAs that were passed in the last, say, 10 years or so, that made it legal for the U.S. government to propagandize its own people? Give me some clarity on that, because I heard that come up again recently.
Yeah.
And it really, that rings true to me in this sense when you're talking about all of these different factions of the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian military could be acting independently, and we don't know because the media is only telling us what they want us to know. Mm-hmm. The Defense Department's only telling us what they want us to know. We have these leaks that are coming out suggesting vastly different things from what we're being told. How do we know if any of what we're hearing from the legacy media is actually true? If that is such the case that they can propagandize us? Yeah,
it's funny because the history of the United States since Woodrow Wilson is full of American government intentionally propagandizing the public. And there were specific acts espionage acts and things like that that enabled that. The recent one I think is 2017 is what you're referring to, NDAA, but I could be wrong about
which is the National Defense Authorization Act.
Right, which is an annual bill that's meant to fund the military and authorize various different uses of force. It sometimes changes policy. When it does so, in the case of what you're talking about was, since World War II, we've had a program for propagandizing the world in order to fight communism. That idea was, in recently said, well, you can now do that in America.
Right. So it was originally intended to be outwardly directed to other countries other than the United States, but this 2017, I think, NDAA shifted that inwards, saying you can now do that inside the borders of the United States.
Right. And this is a typical example of what we call the boomerang effect. And this happens across lots of different foreign policy areas that then come back around to America. Great example. The CIA was forbidden from doing anything in the United States in domestic operations. That was the domain of the FBI, which had more constraint about what they could do. And then we discovered that they were doing that. So we had the Church Commission that came up with a bunch of reforms. A lot of those reforms were then repealed under the Patriot Act and the NDAA since. So there's this, and conservatives really have to hear this, right? It's hard for them to hear, but you really got to hear this, is that anytime you push out internationally, you create the propensity for that to blow back. Not just in foreign policy actors, but in your own domestic policy. Everything from militarizing the police is another great example. We create military equipment, sell excess military equipment, and use military equipment back to the police force. And so then when you show up in Ferguson, you got a guy on an armored vehicle facing a crowd with a sniper rifle rather than a police car, in a domestic policing situation.
Right.
Each of those, including, everything from warrantless wiretaps to the way we handle international assassinations. For example, Anwar al-Awlaki and his son,
who are U.S. citizens, and they were killed by a drone strike overseas, correct?
Yeah, right.
Under Obama.
Under Obama.
Without a warrant, with no process. And the question is, do you lose those rights as an American citizen even when you believe something wrong, or even when you're, potentially collaborating or in the company in the same car with a criminal, right? If you're in a car with a criminal in the United States and we just blew up the car, that would be a problem.
That would be a problem.
Rand Paul actually got, a lot of clout for coming out and saying, hey, drone strikes on American citizens are not okay. And that's what was in the NDAA of that year, was effectively, their ability, clarifying their legal ability to do so. So I think that indefinite detention, another one. For many years, there was claims that there was these things called CIA black sites, where they would take people, foreign nationals, and torture them using the governments of Egypt and other governments that were puppets of the United States government to get around the rules that the CIA can't torture. Right?
Torture by proxy.
Right. And that was a conspiracy theory that turned out to be, validated over time through various different, leaks, media leaks, and actual, situations that blew back that we discovered in the wake of the Arab Spring. The trick that I think most people have to grapple with is, if you really want a robust defense, but it is unrestrained by a vision of what that means, you're running into this process of the people who have the most interest to expand the intelligence and security state the most are never limited by, the formal institutions, unless you have very strong laws around it. And we haven't for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So any of these presidents that are talking about how they want to reform our foreign policy, but don't address those legal components of that, are not going to get anywhere in the long run. You have to change that so that not only, and then additionally, you got to address the intelligence component, the knowledge of it. If most congressmen don't know about the actions of our military and our intelligence state, how can they hold them accountable?
Right.
You have a gang of eight out of 150 that actually know what's going on.
Wow.
And that's a formal group called the Gang of Eight, right? Mm-hmm. That is supposedly a check on the president's ability to use these powers. It's largely captured by people who are been there the longest and have the most clout
in the establishment, in the part of the deep state, if you will.
Right. And can only really get transparency into these situations with, an accident, right? Like the Snowden leak or, James Clapper saying something stupid in committee or something like that.
Right. Well, which I was just about to say, it seems like we've been getting most of our information on all these things from leaks and whistleblowers as of late. And I mean, is the the fight against this sort of opacity and obfuscation of the truth by way of the media and the intelligence community really most effective by pursuing more robust whistleblower protections. Is that something that, because, this kid, Jack Teixeira, I think the National Guardsman who leaked the information about the Russia-Ukraine war, he's sitting in a jail cell and will probably sit there for a long time. And his name has dropped out of the news. We're not talking about him anymore. We're not talking about Julian Assange much anymore. I mean, periodically people are still fighting on his behalf, but Chelsea Manning as well. I mean, there are all these characters throughout the history of the United States, recent history of the United States, that have brought really important information to light to the public that hasn't been able to come out through the proper channels that we needed to know. Important things about our privacy and our safety, domestically and internationally. And, it's only been able to be done by these sort of what the media would call nefarious, bad actors or people that want to, undermine the national security of the United States. But really what they're undermining is their control of the narrative.
Right. And it's the capture by the corporate media, by the culture of DC and the blob, what I call the blob, right? That all-encompassing culture of DC of the best people, the smartest people are in charge. We've got to trust them and make sure that they protect the country, as opposed to a republic, which operates on the idea of popular sovereignty, which operates on the idea that you have to tell the public what you're doing in order to be accountable to the common vision of what is America. And we've lost that. We've lost that for so long. People forget that that's what we're supposed to be.
Yeah, most people refer to America as a democracy, not a republic,
Right.
which is technically not true per the founding documents, but per what actually goes on, this isn't a republic.
It's actually worse than that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
probably not even a democracy.
right. I mean,
No, it should be referred to as an empire, right?
yeah, right.
As we so
a
often
banana
refer to.
republic, perhaps.
Well,
Yeah.
watch Gladiator, right? You have this really interesting contrast in the Gladiator movie with Russell Crowe between the vision of the emperor, right? To be an empire, you have to have a unitary state, and the Senate, which is a representation of representative democracy, right? And the whole argument there is, well, in order you have to have someone who embodies the spirit of the people, and they're just like trying to be a populist, right? As he's talking to the people who are actually elected. That's a little bit closer to where we're at, right? Where you have permanent intelligence and military apparatchiks that are in charge of making these decisions with very little accountability at all. And that vision of being a republic is the idea that you're a country of laws where they're limited by the authority and power delegated to them to then operate within this bound. And those laws exist, but we've systematically chipped away at them over time. And until you have someone who's saying, no, I'm going to repeal X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to implement these range of reforms. I mean, credit where credit's due. Vivek Ramaswamy has by far the most detailed amount of this is what I'm going to do with the intelligence state in order to reform them. I think this is the moment for that. Beyond anything we've gotten to, the Twitter files obviously brought a lot of attention to it. But additionally to that, we have all of the craziness that's happened with Trump, with the weaponization of these insiders against a sitting democratically elected president. This is the moment for that. And what I hope is people insist on reforming the space. And that's one thing DeSantis did not talk about.
Well, we shall see if he gets any more clear or deliberate about speaking on that topic. Did he talk about
Not that I heard.
the debt limit?
Oh, did he talk about that?
I don't remember.
The Trey Crowdy, that interview that we played a little bit ago, he does touch on that. And of course, I mean, what he talks about is we need spending cuts, right? He's going to support the Republican House's deal, which effectively freezes spending.
Spend more, but just spend a little less than more.
Well, it's called a cut, but what it is a cut in the growth of spending, right? There's an automatic built-in spending growth pattern curve, which even right now is less than inflation.
So it's apocalyptic, but like a couple years later.
Yeah, I mean, and don't get me wrong, a lot of these things, to steel man the Democrats' argument, a lot of these things are purely, social services cuts and taking back, I love the word, clawing back unspent COVID funds, which is very interesting. We got into such a drunken spending spree that we had so much money, we didn't even spend it all. that we printed out of thin air. And then we're like, inflation's terrible. What are we going to do about inflation? Like that's the status of the American federal government right now.
And meanwhile, we have countries all over the world fleeing the U.S. dollar like rats from a sinking ship.
Right. Which is very dangerous. So you have two pressures, right? You have so we have this debt limit, right? We explained it last podcast. It's like a credit card. We put in a credit card. We maxed our limit. Now we can go take out another credit card and increase our limit. And you have people saying, hey, we need to cut some domestic spending. We got to cut our household budget a little bit. And then you have the Democrats saying we need to increase our income. We need more taxes, more revenue. In order to solve this problem, and we're not going to sign it. So the Democrats in the Senate are saying we're not going to sign something that just cuts spending. We have to get tax increases. And in fact, you're also not cutting military spending, which is ironic because they're all pro-Ukraine spending. And then you have, the presidency who's really not negotiating at this juncture. I mean, really just staying out of it and basically saying this is all wrong, this is all bad, you guys are going to crash the economy. Because when we can't service the debt, what happens to treasury bonds?
They become worthless or worth less.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just undermines confidence that any investment you make now is going to be paid in the future.
Exactly.
Right. But this is a place we've been many, many times in the past. And the same thing plays out. The debt limits hit, they start shutting down government services. The media all says, did you know that you can no longer visit Yellowstone National Park? And people go, ah! And they all lose their minds. Even though that you totally could go see Yellowstone National Park if the government prioritized their spending rather than trying to shut down all the things that most directly impact you. In fact, last time I was actually in DC during one of these debates and one of these fights. And one of the funny stories that happened on the ground was the lawn on the national lawn was growing too tall. And so this guy just came out with his own lawnmower and he was just driving around mowing the lawn. And they stopped him. Like police had to stop him and be like, sir, you're trespassing. You can't do that here. Because he's not the official lawn service guy. Like you gotta.
He's like, but I own this land.
This land is my land. This land is your land.
Start singing the middle school song.
That's communist propaganda.
That's crazy. So not only did they waste money by arresting the guy, they didn't let him do a free service for the government in a time of need.
Classic government.
They don't take charity.
Yeah.
Don't they?
Well, it just goes to show you that in the absence of government, we'd still have charity. Yeah. But the debt limit debate is an interesting one because it is defining, the question of like, how do we want our government to operate? And do we want more taxes? Do we want less spending? And the trick is, the American public can be very immature about this. We want all the benefits of government services without having to pay for them. That's why we're $32 trillion in debt. The Congress is reflecting if you poll the American public and say, hey, should we cut taxes? Absolutely. Should we cut services? No. How could you do that, you monster? Right? They say the same thing at the same time. So like that inability to, I don't know why I always go back to this, be an adult about the question is so difficult for folks. And mostly because, ultimately the government is the largest insurer, it's the largest employer, the largest everything in the economy. And so there's going to be a lot of pain when it has to pull back.
Well, yeah. And I mean, so far because the dollar is the world reserve currency, we can leverage it so far like we have been able to as a country for many generations already. We've been able to have our cake and eat it too. There hasn't been a consequence. So it's not like people have any frame of reference for what is going to happen eventually. It's going to take that in order for people to go, oh crap, like now there just aren't services. Like I don't really have a choice anymore to like gracefully kind of get my way out of this or get our way out of this. It's gonna crumble. There will be nothing for us to have in that case, no services or whatever. I don't know how severe it's gonna be or not, but it seems like we're not willing to think around that corner as a populace because we don't have a frame of reference for it.
Right. And a lot of this is happening very slowly over a long period of time, right? So when Democrats say, if you hit the debt ceiling limit, you don't increase it, you're going to crash the economy. Yeah. Why? Because all these banks are heavily leveraged into treasury bonds, not real assets, into promises that they will be paid back by the government.
Which is supposed to, historically, has always been the safe move, right? Like that's the non-risky asset for these hedge funds that we call banks.
During a low interest rate environment. Right. Now that the higher interest rate environment, not as safe, right? That's why these banks are collapsing, right? Because the value prospect long-term on those bonds, those low interest rate bonds are now far lower. So can the Fed monetarily jujitsu us out of that situation? I don't know. I mean, the amount of banks that could collapse if we hit this, and then, people quit buying treasury bonds could be substantial. The existing obligation on the interest rate on the treasury bonds for the U.S. government is substantial part of the budget, right? So we're still not fully solving the inflation problem too. We might need higher interest rates to actually get, this problem under wraps, at least in the measured inflation, much less the real inflation.
Well, and historically, we've gone up to 20% interest rates before.
Yeah.
Like that wouldn't be a new thing for us to do, but it would be very painful if we just, cranked it up right away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what the Fed is doing. It's just like, just a quarter here, a quarter here, a quarter here, and we just keep going. But, we'll see how high we end up getting here.
Right. And that story is the Volcker Fed, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of Jimmy Carter's administration, inflation was this huge problem this entire time. Milton Friedman played a huge role in raising the awareness of the cause of inflation as a monetary phenomena. This guy, Paul Volcker, comes in and he jacks up interest rates really high. And if you talk to everyday people about it, they're like, yeah, it was a terrible time. You couldn't get a loan. But that was needed in order to soak up all that excess liquidity that was there because of years of money printing without, backing it up by real assets that created the inflationary bubble.
And what was the proportion of excess money supply then to the excess money supply we're looking at now?
Yeah. We also have a larger economy now, though.
The curve.
Yeah, and a bigger population and things like that.
True.
So as population increased, larger economy, more productive capacity, that ratio is interesting, but there's not like a number, right? There's no like, oh, you get to 25%, that's when you become grease, right?
More to make the point of like, is it going to be more severe or less severe? Is it going to feel worse than the Volcker era?
Well, it's interesting because the 1960s and 70s were defined by what's called stagflation, which was high unemployment with high inflation simultaneously. We don't have a high employment problem right now. We actually have an underemployment problem right now, for the most part. So because people aren't working, right? There's a lot of able-bodied people who are refusing to get a job. Because also we have enhanced welfare benefits right now that are still in effect, that are still in a lot of states keeping people out of it.
Let me clarify that. So we don't have a high unemployment problem because there are lots of people who aren't working. They're not seeking work, so therefore they're not counted in unemployment figures. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a lot of unemployed people.
Yeah. What I mean is from the business side, right? The business at that time wasn't like, oh my God, I can't fulfill all my roles. You could fulfill your roles, but the jobs were more scarce.
Sure.
Right now we have a lot of jobs that aren't being filled.
Right.
So that what you're hitting on is absolutely correct. There's two sides to that equation.
I just want to make sure, we're clear.
Yeah, and unemployment actually should technically refer to both. Because what you want to do is get to an equilibrium between jobs and open jobs where, the economy sheds off 1 million jobs a month and then also hires on 1 million people. And you have this like churn, right? That's what creates the labor market.
Right. There's always this static amount of unemployment that exists just by nature.
Right. And there was a theory, I forget what the theory is called, but basically what it said was that in a high inflation environment, you have full employment, right? Or you at least you can't have unemployment while you have that inflationary environment. Obviously that was immediately proven distrue. Right. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that was the standard economic theory. The stagflation proved that completely false. We're still kind of operating. The Fed has a mandate that still says that they're supposed to try to keep unemployment low. But what you're right about is like if they're only looking on that one side of the equation. Additionally, that we're in a strange place, right? Because the in-net migration is also in a very strange place because we have so many illegals that it makes it very difficult to actually say how many jobs actually are being fulfilled and what those look like, because we don't have a lot of knowledge about like our legal migrants. We know that they get work or don't, right? Illegals, we don't know. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in that area where we don't actually know the dials and knobs that they're supposedly could turn. They can't turn because they don't know. It's all mirrors and smoke. It's all fugazi. Is that what he says in that meme, right? It's a nothing.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I look at this from my standpoint here, and I don't know if the Fed can get us out of this pickle. I feel like we're in checkmate because really ultimately the Fed has two tools, right? They can print money or they can raise interest rates, and they kind of do opposite things, right? Mm-hmm. And that's an oversimplification, but generally speaking, that's the directionality of it. And if they print more money, inflation goes up. Inflation's already high, so they can't really print more money very easily without exacerbating that problem. They can raise interest rates, but interest rates are already high and people are already struggling to with credit card debt and with getting home loans and car loans. So they can't really do much more of that either. And if they do more of that, then that's going to put pressure on the banks, and that's going to collapse banks. So it's like, we are for sure between the dog and the hydrant here, and we're going to get pissed on. No way around it, in my view.
Right.
I mean, unless they just come up with some genius plan that they've been keeping in their back pocket.
They're going to print $1 trillion coin and then pay themselves with it. That's the big plan.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I'm not joking. It's called the modern monetary theory.
A Ponzi scheme got it. Like degenerate problems require degenerate solutions.
Well, we were also talking before about how we don't have a white pill for this episode, and that was like a pretty black pill moment. So sorry about that, guys. We're not going to save you from this one. You just got to have to stew on that.
Well, the white pill is that this creates an enormous political opportunity, right? The debt limit. If you don't allow people to say the Republicans are crashing the economy by trying to cut spending, that's an opportunity, right? Because the record is so clear here, right? If neither side is willing to come to the table and cut all spending. Yes, that's true. But right now in this environment, raising taxes would be disaster for most people, even if you raise them just on high income folks, right? Because that inevitably captures your upper middle income, that inevitably captures the people who are trying to grow business. And what you need in order to build out of an inflationary moment is a low tax environment, right? Really created in the 1980s was the high interest rate with a low tax environment, right? Because what that did is suck up liquidity while you're creating more productive capacity by taxing people less with the Reagan tax cuts that then allowed for the boom of the 1980s. Now, that was very difficult for a lot of families, but that was because that's the hangover from the 1950s and 60s and spending in that era. We have to get through this hangover, and that hangover creates enormous opportunity to get a Reagan, right? To get that moment where you can hopefully come to the table with some solutions that actually create economic opportunity.
Something that was interesting too is last week the Bitcoin conference was going on in Miami, and you had two presidential candidates, the two that I think we're going to be talking about on this podcast often, is Vivek Ramaswamy and RFK Jr. Is they both spoke at the conference, and Vivek was talking about reducing the headcount of the Fed by 90%, and RFK Jr. was talking about how watching what happened in Canada with the trucker movement, realized the necessity of like freedom of money from the state. And so these ideas are circulating in the ethos a lot more,
which is
very
so
interesting.
Huge. It's so huge to have a Democrat say the biggest danger to civil liberties is government control of money. That is enormous. Like that's such a huge moment because I mean, we've been saying that for
100 years.
100 years. I struggle to put 3 digits on it, but at least 70. That has been very consistent that the government control of money is so fundamental. RFK saying that is a huge win for us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It was awesome to see that. And yeah, it bipartisan, and it goes to what I was saying a couple episodes ago went on here, where the crypto lobby seems to be much more, it seems like it's becoming more influential in politics, where you had like Liz Warren announcing her Senate campaign of being like, I'm building an anti-crypto army and all that stuff. Like it is interesting as just like monetary stuff is core to politics and seems to be one of the major issues. And also is like, if you asked like 5 years ago, the average person, what inflation was, the average person would not be able to answer that. Like inflation is a part of common parlance now, which I think is also, it's a white pill in a sense. It's also kind of a black pill because people are worried about it, but it is a white pill of like, the American public actually understands what inflation is to some degree.
Right.
Like
they just got to nail down the cause of it, right? What you're right about is like, we would talk about monetary policy in like 2008, 2009. People would be like, what are you talking about? This is so ethereal.
Like, money is just money. Like,
right. Of course it goes up and everything goes up in price every year. And then it was like, no, you don't get it. Inflation is this thing where it goes up really quickly. And they're like, they can't. Now they're experiencing it. So the question is, and the challenge is how do we get to more people with the cause of inflation? How do we help them understand that the cause of it is the government monopoly of money and their inability to centrally plan it that inevitably results in a boom-bust cycle that then creates the conditions that we're in today?
How we do it is we turn that into a clip and we put it on YouTube. And it goes viral because you share it.
Yes,
right?
I love it.
Yeah.
In a related field to tech innovation,
this is AI
regulation.
Guys, I got to go.
Oh, is it already time? Oh, geez.
I have a shoot.
Oh, wow.
But you guys want to keep talking?
we can't.
Actually, I need to take one of these cameras. So, I'm sorry. I don't want to cut us short.
You can take that camera.
I can't take that camera. That's the one I need anyway. No, I really do hate to cut it short, but I do have a shoot that I have to do tonight. So
no problem.
Do we want to react real quick to Bill Gates?
yes,
Sounds like a good way to end it.
As a fun way to end it.
Let's do that. That'll be our white pill.
Here, I'll pull this bad boy up, because context of this is it seems that there is now significant evidence that Bill Gates was indeed being blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein. So I've been seeing this clip rummaging around from like a year ago of when he was asked about his relations with Jeffrey Epstein, and he had an interesting answer.
Let's check it out.
Watch his eyes.
What did you do when you found out about his background?
Well, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else
so uncomfortable.
looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so in general, you always have to be careful. I'm very proud of what we've done in philanthropy. Very proud of the work of the foundation.
Quick subject change. Also, he's dead, so I'm not sure how that happened. Wild.
You have to be careful.
Why is this a story? No, what the most recent news is that there was evidence that Richard Epstein was using Jeffrey, sorry, Richard Epstein is someone else. Jeffrey Epstein, I don't want to disparage somebody, was using his affair with a woman, a grown adult woman, to try to get him to donate to Jeffrey Epstein's
like put my name on this charity kind of a stuff.
Well, it was a hedge fund that he was trying to start at the time that he wanted him to put in for. And he was like not very subtly, I know that this is a thing. You should consider donating. And so what it does is it gives some evidence to the architecture for the argument that Jeffrey Epstein's role for potentially some intelligence state someplace was to basically get dirt on these high net worth individuals through philanthropy and through his airplane and this island and all these things that he's been accused of, to put people in compromising situations and then use that for intelligence service purposes.
Yeah.
Which is, we have evidence for it. We don't have all the evidence, right? We have the means, right? We have the airplane, we have the island, we have the money, we have the meetings, we have some of the material evidence, indirect, right? We have, young women who have said that this is a thing. And what we don't have is the ultimate material evidence, which is the logbook.
The client list.
Right. We know Ghislaine Maxwell tried, found guilty as being...
And also her father, the British government says, was a double agent for Mossad. And he ran the whole media empire in Great Britain that pushed for the war in Israel in the 40s. Right. And he was found dead naked off of a yacht.
Oh, of course.
So, there is a lot of connections that exist here that suggest the intelligence apparatus stuff.
Well, the interesting thing about Ghislaine Maxwell, too, is she was tried and convicted for trafficking.
Right.
But we don't know who or to whom, right? Is more importantly.
And in sex crimes specifically, it's not typical. It's the more typical thing is to know who the Johns were, right? Not that's who you go after, right? Because they're the adult responsible who is supposed to say no in this situation where they're offered something illegal. And in this case, that has not been released. So the more noise made about this, the more consistent noise, I think is a net good for people to draw attention to that this is a cover-up. That this is something that is being ignored because it's inconvenient for the people who run the media.
Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself.
And all of us live very happy lives, and if any of us are found unalived, it wasn't our own doing. And on that note, I'm sorry I have to go early. It's because I have a day job. But if you like, subscribe, follow, comment, share the podcast with your friends, maybe, just maybe, we can all make this our day jobs, and then I won't have to cut our awesome conversation short. But we appreciate you for watching. We'll be back with another one next week. Thank you, David. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Evan. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
See ya.